I'm Michael Krasny, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. It's a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews. You can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. We cover a wide range of timely and intellectually engaging topics, distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. In this episode, we begin the first of 4 episodes I am excited and honored to be bringing to you, sponsored by Stanford University's Bill Lane Center for the American West, and focusing on a range of topics related to the North American West, a place whose natural beauty is matched only by the challenges it faces. Our hope is that this series will draw attention to the region, particularly in this era of climate change. The Lane Center was co-founded in 2005 by today's guest, David M. Kennedy, who is professor of history emeritus at Stanford and author of many books and recipient of many awards, including a Pulitzer Prize for his book Freedom from Fear, The American People in Depression and War. As a premier place of study for Western land and life, the Bill Lane Center has become a national hub of scholarship, programming, and reporting focused on Western governance and policy, environment and energy, and history, arts, and culture. With historians, writers, thinkers, and tribal leaders, we'll be spending episodes defining and understanding the region, which is characterized by frontier mythology, vast distances, marked aridity, and unique political and economic characteristics. And we'll explore the West's water and wildfire crises, its energy and equity issues, its people, its borders, and the need for educating future leaders who can serve as stewards of the region and its magnificent natural resources. I want to thank the Bill Lane Center for the American West and its current director, Professor Bruce Kane, for sponsoring this series, and we invite you to visit the center's website at west.stanford.edu to learn more about its research, programs, and journalism. And you can also follow the Bill Lane Center on Instagram, Threads, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And now let me officially welcome our guest, David Kennedy.
Well, thank you, Michael. Always a pleasure to be with you.
And the pleasure is mutual. And let's begin by kind of a broad question, but nevertheless one that intrigues me and probably has intrigued you. What is the West? I mean, I've been kind of reflecting on this. Of course, it's a geographical region, but there's a real West and a mythic West. We have to deal with both, don't we?
Yes, we do. Well, we teach a course at Stanford sponsored by the Lane Center. We think it's the most, it's called simply The West. That's the title of the course. And we think it's the most multidisciplinary course in the universe. And we begin with, because there are 4 people that teach it, I'm the historian, there's a political scientist, that's Bruce Kane, whom you just mentioned, a person in literature from the English department, Shelley Fisher-Fishkin, and a hydrological geologist, David Freiberg. And we all took the vow when we started teaching this course a dozen years ago that we would all be in the classroom for all sessions. So it's not just a parade of visiting lecturers. But anyway, we begin the course with exactly that question. What is the West? And we dog it for the next 10 or 11 weeks. And there is no simple and certainly no unitary answer to that question. And again, maybe I can give you a little bit of the flavor of the complexity we try to introduce when we teach this stuff. I begin with the first lecture, first day. We do 2 lectures per session. So I'm the first lecture, first hour of the first day. And I say we're going to focus mostly on the United States when the West enters the greater narrative of American history, which is the early to mid-19th century. So the next lecture, and I talk about the Civil War and Reconstruction period and how that opened to the door to all kinds of development in the Western region. So then David Freiberg comes up to the stage, gives the second lecture of the day, and we've now got it into a little bit of a routine. He says, well, now Professor Kennedy has taken us back 200 years, for an historian, that's a big arc of time. But now I'm the geologist here on this faculty, and I'm going to take you back 3.6 billion years. And then he proceeds to describe the geological formation of the West, which underlies, of course, a lot of its character to this day, 3.6 billion years later. It's why the West has more topographic variance. It's more mountainous and has more differentiated geological features, desert and mountain and aridity and seashore and so on, than other regions of the United States, indeed many other regions in the world. It's why the West is so rich in commercially mineable materials like gold and coal and copper and on and on. That's all deeply embedded in the deep time of geological history in the region. So then the students in the first day begin to get a sense of there's no simple answer to that question. what is the West? It's a very complicated matter. And if we're successful in this discussion and your program here over the next several sessions and in our course, people come away understanding that this is a very complex region and its complexity defines its uniqueness and its distinctive character.
Well, we often associate the West with certain kinds of, I suppose we could call them archetypes. Particularly the frontier and the constant move westward toward the expansion that began. When you think about the Louisiana Purchase, you think about so many historical facts that just kept building the West, the gold rush and so forth. It was something that just kept burgeoning and expanding.
Yeah, and again, if you bear down on this, there are actually two quite distinctive westward movements. The one that most people are familiar with, it's historically well established and well studied, extends from roughly, the formation of the Republic, 1770s, down to roughly the immediate post-Civil War era. And then if you track on a timeline the westward movement, it stops, or essentially comes to all but a full screeching halt between about roughly 1870 and 1950, or 1940, let's say. So what happens? Well, that's because the frontier line reached approximately the 100th meridian, which is the definition. The 100th meridian defines the eastern boundary of the arid region of the United States. And settlement simply couldn't proceed until enormous engineering projects had begun to make the region habitable on a scale that begins to approach the population densities of the eastern part of the continent. So, and who's the agent that initiates all of those big infrastructural projects? I'm talking about irrigation, the management of water in the arid region, especially. Well, it's the federal government. It builds dams. It builds the interstate highway system. It had built the Transcontinental Railroad in the 19th century. And here's where we enter upon something you just touched on, Michael, is the tension, if not outright contradiction, between the facts of life in the region, the terms of life in the region, what made the terms of life possible, and the mythology. Because I can tell you without hesitation that the federal government, over 2 centuries, has done more to shape the character of life in the Western region than all the cowboys and pioneers and frontiersmen and Indian fighters and miners and loggers and so on there ever were.
Well, forgive me, isn't over 50% of the public land owned by the government?
It's actually more than 50%. You have to do it state by state, but in the 17 Western states that are in whole or in part west of the 100th meridian, I suppose roughly 50% to this day is still owned by the federal government. The Bureau of Land Management is the biggest agency. It owns hundreds of millions of acres. Forest Service is another, is second. And then you go down to much smaller percentage of the West is owned by the Park Service, the military, and so on. But it's the federal government that built these enormous engineering projects to harvest the water from the Colorado River system and the Snake Columbia River system and so on. And that's what has made life in this region possible. Without those investments, the West would still be woefully underpopulated. Today, the 17 Western states in the continental U.S., or lower 48, as they say, not counting Alaska and Hawaii, but the 17 states that are in whole or in part west of the 100th meridian, 1 out of every 3 Americans lives in these states. 1 out of every 5 Americans lives in either California or Texas, which are the 2 biggest states, and they're both Western states. California unambiguously, Texas you can have an argument whether it's Western or Southern. And 1 out of every 8 Americans lives in California alone. So none of those population numbers that I've just mentioned would be remotely conceivable if it hadn't been for federal investment in transportation, irrigation, power generation, and so on.
And yet most people, when they think of the West, think of TV shows and Western movies and so forth. They don't think of the federal government.
That's right. They think of Gary Cooper and and Have Gun Will Travel and dime novels and Smile When You Say That, Partner. And this deep mythology about the lone individual rugged character who conquered the wilderness and so on and so forth. And there's something to that story. I don't mean to say it's all totally historical fiction. but it is inconsequential compared to the kind of investment that the federal government has made over Democratic and Republican administrations and over approximately 2 centuries of development.
Bring it up to date for a moment. Some of these resources are obviously threatened now, not only because of climate change. The greatness of the West has to do with its resources. And the Colorado River now, for example, is facing some serious challenges and so forth. And the federal government playing a very similar role? Is it continuing to move along the kind of trajectory that it has in the past?
Well, I think that's a jackpot question. And again, it's a subset of a more general question about whether the federal government is capable of doing anything of consequence in our current political climate and division, polarization, and so on. But yes, the Colorado River we think is the most managed water system, river system at least, in this country, possibly even in the world at large. The 7 states in the Colorado River Compact, which was put together by Herbert Hoover when he was Secretary of Commerce back in the 1920s. The federal government was kind of the midwife to the formation of the Colorado River Compact, and the feds retained some residual authority over the river if the member states in the compact can't agree on certain things. And the river, when the Colorado River Compact was first drawn up in the 1920s, you might say it was designed by men. It was almost all men, by the way, born in the 19th century using very late 19th, early 20th century scientific data, best they had available to them at the time. And then the system, beginning with Hoover Dam is the big one, comes online in 1935, built with technologies of the early and mid 20th century. But when the compact, when it was first formed, the estimate was that the average annual flow of the Colorado River was something like 17 million acre feet per year. To the best of my knowledge, it has never or almost never actually flowed at that rate. But the allocation among the states was done volumetrically. So each state got a number of acre feet that it was entitled to. And then, thanks to a treaty in the 1940s, Mexico also gets a piece of it. So the river's never lived up to its reputation of actually flowing at 17 million acre feet per year, and it's over-allocated to an extreme. And thanks to climate change, as well as increasing population densities in the upper basin, the river is giving less and less of itself, you might say, to the American Southwest. And some 25 or 30 million people in the Southwest depend heavily on the Colorado River for their livelihood, not just hydropower, but irrigation as well. And the river just can't live up to its expectations. And climate change is a big piece of that.
When you mentioned Herbert Hoover, I can't help thinking about some of your scholarship. And you were actually made me aware of the fact that Herbert Hoover was a really smart man. And the expectation was that he was going to be a great president. And of course, that was not what was fulfilled. But I'm interested in the fact that you're so drawn to the West and a co-founder of the Bill Lane Center. What was it that drew you to the West? You were kind of an interdisciplinary, I think you started out studying engineering. Am I right about that?
Yes, you are.
And then became interested in doing, well, you did some really yeoman work on Margaret Sanger and birth control and World War I, and didn't necessarily focus on the West until later. And now I know you're more of a generalist with the West, but also have this prominent, distinguished career as a scholar. What drew you to the West?
Well, it's kind of like all things, I suppose. It's complicated. I was born in the West and raised in Seattle. And for reasons that are a little bit mysterious to think through, I've just identified as a Westerner. It's part of my identity in a way that really speaks to me. So I've often joked, I went to graduate school. I was an undergraduate at Stanford. That's when I switched from engineering to history. And then I went for my graduate training at Yale and lived, of course, in Connecticut for 4 years. And I've often joked that I have something in common with both William Jennings Bryan and Barry Goldwater, who usually aren't mentioned in the same sentence. But the three of us have something in common. We all think of New England as enemy country. It's a different place. And I never felt comfortable living there, to be honest. And so that's kind of in the background of my own DNA, you might say. But when I was a dean at Stanford and then the department chair, back in the 80s mostly, I would get frequent inquiries from people in different disciplines, not just history, who wanted to know, they wanted to study the West, the economics of it, the geography, the history, whatever, the environment. And they wanted to know what program Stanford had to offer as the self-proclaimed leading higher educational institution in the region, if not in the entire known world. I was embarrassed to have to reply consistently, well, we don't have anything. So this got me thinking, and I started agitating inside Stanford to address this issue and make Stanford a place that really took seriously its neighborhood. And Stanford is deeply involved with the history of the region, going all the way back to Leland Stanford and the Transcontinental Railroad, not to mention Herbert Hoover, the first president from west of the Mississippi, and a Stanford graduate. So I finally got some support from Bill Lane, who was with his brother Mel, they ran Sunset Magazine and Books, publications that are iconic representations of life in the region, I suppose one might say. And Bill, not Mel, but Bill, stepped up and gave us our initial contribution, put us in business about 20 some years ago, and we've gone on from there. So I think I can say without false modesty that we're quite proud of what the Lane Center has become, and Stanford is now well established as a place for the serious study of the region. I might add, is parenthetically, or not so parenthetically to that we're in the process of acquiring a major archival collection. And I think, since it hasn't been publicly announced, I don't think I'm allowed to say exactly where it's coming from, but it's 18,000 linear feet. That's over 3 miles of manuscript boxes of California and regional history going back to the Spanish period in the 18th century. So it's a huge collection that will put Stanford clearly in the league with the Bancroft Library at Berkeley, the Huntington Library in Southern California, the Yale Library, all of which have enormous collections pertaining to the region. I think we will step right up at the head of that league, I think, once we have that all in place.
Well, there's a good deal of Western chauvinism, too.
Well, yeah.
It comes through.
You're hearing that, are you?
Subtext, yeah. What do you think California now and so many Western states have become identified because of climate change with wildfires, with disasters, really, and particularly the kinds of disasters that almost seem apocalyptic? That wasn't the Old West. And in fact, I was thinking about, you probably know W.J. Cash's book about the South. I was thinking, in the Mind of the South, he makes a distinction between the Old South and the New South. There's kind of an Old West and a New West, and the New West is much more sort of final days or apocalyptic.
Yeah, well, actually, there'd be other ways to think of that Old West, New West. I mean, historically, the West, to use the phrase I used earlier, when it entered the narrative of American history, was thought of Bernard DeVoto, great writer about the West, great patron of Wallace Stegner, another great writer about the West. He once described the West as a colonial economy. It was a place that sent its raw materials eastward and then bought finished goods from the eastern part of the United States.
We should mention Stegner was called the Dean of Western Literature.
Although he personally resented being thought of as a regional writer. He didn't want to, but it was a little bit crazy because the region was the locus of almost all of his best writing. But in any case, you can't be a student of history terribly long without developing a deep sense of irony. So here's this colonial economy, enters the narrative of American history in the 19th century, even well into the 20th century. And Michael, you may be old enough to remember, even in my childhood, in a lot of national publications advertising such and such a product, a toaster, an automobile, whatever it would be, there would be a little subnote, priced slightly higher west of the Rockies. It was thought to be such a distant place that you had to charge more to get the thing here. Well, think of that in the present context, where the West, especially these two, now I guess maybe even 3, if not 4, centers of high-tech development, Silicon Valley, Puget Sound, San Diego, Austin, they're the drivers, the locomotives of the modern economy. And they're the most cutting-edge, high-tech features of the modern economy, and they're all Western. And again, it's an interesting question that nobody has fully satisfactorily answered. Was it just some complete random accident that Silicon Valley happened to be in Santa Clara County, California, and Microsoft, et cetera, happened to be in the Puget Sound region? Or is there something still not fully defined about the character, the ethos, whatever, of this region that proved to be particularly nurturing of this kind of rapid high technology development? Nobody has matched it yet. A lot of people have tried. A lot of countries have tried. A lot of other cities and regions have tried. And there's been some success elsewhere, to be sure, but nothing quite yet is caught up. So what is that? I don't pretend to have the answer to that question. A number of people have written about it. I think probably, in my experience, most persuasively or provocatively, Margaret O'Mara at the University of Washington, particularly her recent book called The Code, which tries to get fairly granular about what were the features of California in particular, institutional apparatus or environment and landscape, as well as attitudinal environment that made Silicon Valley possible. But I think the world awaits a fully comprehensive answer to that question still.
Yeah, you've got me speculating. There are some big questions with the West that kind of haunt our imaginations, those of us who study these kinds of things. And another one is, why the violence? It still seems to be, you have to conquer the West, and there was all that kind of rhetoric and language back in the day.
Yeah.
Civilize the West.
Yeah. And the phrase the Wild West is still in our vocabulary. We use it metaphorically, applied to all kinds of things. And again, the reality of the notion of the Wild West is that it was settled in a period, mostly settled in the period after the Civil War, when settlers got out in front of responsible institutions, law enforcement, and so on. And it was a relatively lawless place, and lawless is a pretty essential precondition for violence. So there's some reality to that, I think. But again, this is another instance of where one of the characteristics of the region from the 19th century somehow or other persists into the modern world. So usually the violence in the West is usually associated with the military campaigns against native peoples, against the Indians in the West. And there's a distinctive historical feature to that. By the time settlement starts to reach in the mid-19th century, starts to reach into what we think of today as the West, white European and American settlers confronted Indians who were different from East Coast Indians for a very particular, concrete, specific reason. They were mounted on horseback. And horses didn't really appear in North America, especially the western part of North America, until after a specific event in 1680 in New Mexico, when the Pueblo peoples revolted against their Spanish overlords, slaughtered many of them, and sent them packing back into New Spain or Old Mexico. And the Spaniards left in such a hurry, they left behind very large horse herds. And the Pueblo people started selling these and trading them and letting them loose, and they became feral. After 1680, within a generation, a horse generation or two or three, there's horses all over the western part of the United States. And it utterly transformed the lives of peoples like the Comanche and the Sioux and so on, who never had horses before. Now they did. They could hunt differently, and they could fight better. So when U.S. military confronted the eastern tribes in the 18th and very early 19th century, they were mobile. They had means of delivery of weapon systems and so on. The Indians couldn't match, and it was no contest. But in the West, mounted Indian warriors were mighty effective. And so the effort to extinguish them, that's the wrong word, the effort to control them, actually was much more difficult because they were better armed and they were mounted and mobile and hard to confront in a major battle, but they were wily in guerrilla warfare, mobile warfare. So it's a different story. And the place where that story comes into particularly sharp focus is Texas, because arguably the most efficiently mounted Indian tribe were the Comanche. And they were heavy on the ground in Texas as white settlement progressed in Texas, and Texas in particular has a truly violent history of confronting the native peoples and trying to subdue them by force of arms.
It's a very dark chapter in American history. It remains so, but there's also an attempt, it seems sometimes, to almost look at things monolithically, like talking about cowboys and Indians, as if Indians are, there were many different tribes. The Comanches were different, and you can see the difference between one tribe to the next. But when we talk about the West, we talk about 4 states that right now, to this day, have a minority-majority population. And we have the biggest population of Native Americans in this region of any other region in the country, really, don't we?
There are 360, I think, 360 some so-called Indian reservations. About 100 of them are in California. And we don't often think about that because the big ones are down in the Southwest and in the upper Midwest. Sioux Reservation, the northern parts, and the Navajo and Apache in particular in the Southwest. Most of the reservations and all of the really big ones, with the exception of Seminole in Florida, are in the West. And there's a greater incidence of Indian presence, Native American presence in the region that is still alive and actually making its political and economic and cultural influence felt more poignantly every day, especially in environmental issues. So yeah, it's another distinguishing feature of the region is that there's a violent history of confrontation with Native peoples, and now this is another Old West, New West, maybe kind of transition, to use your language. That now Native peoples are increasingly consequential actors, especially on environmental issues, not least of all with respect to water. Because in water law, this is a complicated matter. I'll just try to briefly sketch it. But there's something called reserved rights. And the federal government superintends so-called reserved rights. And lots of Indian tribes have reserved water rights. Therefore, those are senior rights in the appropriative rights system is, again, uniquely characteristic of this region. And they're increasingly powerful actors. The Lane Center is going to put on a symposium this coming spring in 2025. It's going to be focused on the Pacific Northwest region. And we're going to talk about several different things, including the ongoing today renegotiation between the U.S. and Canada of the Columbia River Treaty. And we're going to talk about efforts at co-managing resource industries like timber and fisheries, which don't really know the ecological systems don't know what the political boundary, the 49th parallel, is all about. But both countries have to cooperate managing these industries. But we're also going to focus especially on how a number of Salish or Northwest Indian tribes across the 49th parallel boundary are increasingly cooperating with respect to environmental issues and doing things, for example, like preventing coal and oil export terminals in Washington State and British Columbia, as well as Oregon for that matter. And it's, again, an interesting turn of the wheel of history where these peoples who were all but driven out of existence 100 years ago are now increasingly consequential players in particularly environmental management issues.
Consequential in what ways?
They've learned how to organize politically. They've learned how to influence the institutions of their respective societies in Canada and the United States, and in states like Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and so on. And they have weight in the political system today they didn't have a couple of generations ago. I'll give you one concrete example. There was a Northwest Indian in Washington State. His name is Barney Frank, and he agitated for years to protect Native American fishing rights in the Northwest, Washington State in particular. And a federal judge by the name of Bolt in the early 1970s ruled that the 1850s treaties that then military governor of Washington Territory, Isaac Stevens, had concluded with various tribes, all the way from the mouth of Strait of Juan de Fuca, the Makah Indians there, all the way to the Yakima Indians in the interior. All these treaties stipulated that the native peoples would have access to their traditional fishing grounds and rights and so on in perpetuity, and that Indians and whites would share the fish harvest equally. Okay? Well, nobody thought much about that language for 100 years, but thanks to Indian agitation, Judge Bolt was compelled to look at this thing, and he ruled that what equal access to the fisheries meant was that native peoples got 50% of the annual catch. Well, this at a stroke put a lot of white fishermen out of business because they've been used to taking the catch in proportion to their presence in the population, 90%, 95%.
Whatever they could catch.
Yeah. And now it's 50%. So, and this induced a lot of behavior at a certain point. I happen to know that a certain number of white fishermen married Indian women in order to get access to the Indian allocation of the catch. But again, it's a specific example, a rather famous one in the Puget Sound area, of how focused and organized Indian political agitation and pressure and effort had real consequences for reshaping the nature of access to natural resources.
Well, one of the generalizations about the West with respect to government shaping is that populist culture plays a central role, direct democracy, options, and highly fractured systems of jurisprudence. But it's still lobbying and money for the most part, isn't it? And do the Indians have, or the native populations have more resources now that they have casinos and the like?
Well, yeah, exactly. So the antecedent to their having casinos was their effective lobbying to be licensed to have casinos. And now a lot of them, not all by any means, but a lot of tribes have casinos, which are money makers. And that's given them the financial resources to get organized about other issues. So this is a kind of a cascading effect or a cumulative effect of their effective organization. A lot of East Coast Indians, frankly, have casinos as well. But I dare say, without this is just an impression, that there are more Indian casinos per capita or per population in the Western states than there are elsewhere.
Well, some statistics that kind of I was marveling a bit at along those lines. There's much more of a women's suffragette movement in the West than there is in the East or any of the other three other sections. I'm thinking about the Census Bureau section.
Yeah.
And there's also more of a gender distinction in the West. There are more males here than females in any other section.
Yeah, and the first state to enfranchise women was a state that, well, it wasn't a state, it was still a territory in those days, was Wyoming.
Yeah.
And again, that's for a lot of people, that seems like some kind of inexplicable anomaly. But it's a special case of Western states. Mind you, there are only three Western states that were in the Union before the Civil War: California, Oregon, and Texas. All the other 14 lower 48 continental U.S. states become states only after the Civil War. And there's this residue of feeling distant from Washington, D.C. and wanting more authority and power in their own hands that persists to this day. Things like the so-called Sagebrush Rebellion that got the former Secretary of the Interior in the Reagan administration in a bit of trouble. Agitation for the new state of Jefferson that some people want to create in embracing Southern Oregon, Northern California. And also a more serious and consequential feature of this peculiar pattern of settlement in this region is that the Western states, California in particular, California and Oregon, pioneered a lot of direct democracy institutions that make the politics and the political culture of this region somewhat different. So the first state that had a binding presidential primary was Oregon in 1910, and quickly followed by California under Governor Hiram Johnson in 1912. California embraced a lot of the same ideas. So there's more direct democracy, which makes in the West than there is elsewhere. It's not unknown elsewhere, but there's more of it here. And this is a little bit heretical to say because you're not supposed to ever say anything bad about democracy. But direct democracy makes politics a lot more volatile. When governance is substantially or partially removed from the hands of well-established, smoke-filled room titans of politics and put in the hands of the people. It's more subject to the volatility of popular whim and so on and so forth. So again, another numerical example. The U.S. Constitution, which is over 2 centuries old, has been amended, 26 times, I think, is it, or 27? The California Constitution, which is about 100 years younger, dates from 1879, has been amended over 500 times, largely by popular referendum and initiative. And again, it makes California's political and regulatory landscape really complicated in ways that would be less true absent the access to constitutional amendment via the referendum and initiative process.
Yeah, California has become really, for all practical purposes, a blue state. And then you mentioned Wyoming. It's a very red state. Montana's a very red state. I mean, the West is divided politically.
Well, here again, the ironies are really interesting to contemplate. I'll go back to what I said earlier about how the federal government has been the principal agent that has developed this region up to its current economic, social level. And yet, particularly in the interior West, the federal government is hotly resented. So that's another mystery that remains to be thoroughly explained. I'm currently talking to you from Idaho, and it was in Montana briefly the last few days. And there's evident signs all over the landscape here that people hate the federal government. And yet they get hydropower from federally built dams. They irrigate their fields with federally provided water. It's just a little bit of a puzzle.
Well, you made me aware of something that sort of solved the puzzle. You kind of located in some of your writing the fact that the conservative movement in general really was centered and began in the 1930s.
Yes.
In America.
Yeah. What we know as modern day conservatism is largely a reaction to the expansion of federal agencies and power and so on in the 1930s under the aegis of the New Deal.
The FDR stuff, yeah.
Yeah. It's not that conservatism was unknown before that, but its principal focus being hostility to the federal government and to big government of all kinds. That's largely a product of the last rough century since the New Deal.
But so much in the West.
Yes.
So much centered in the West.
Yeah,
really.
yeah. And in the South now, too, of course, and that's got its own complicated history thanks to the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. But yeah, in the West, it's a deeply rooted tradition.
Well, I was also struck by something you said. You know, when people think of figures of the West, I don't know, they think of mostly fictional figures, Wyatt Earp and, people who are associated with, again, Billy the Kid and Doc Holliday and all those kinds of figures. But you mentioned Thoreau, which I was struck by because you usually associate Thoreau with New England and Walden Pond, and you mentioned Bishop Berkeley.
Or Barclay, as he said. But
yeah, Barclay is his pronunciation. Exactly.
We Americanized it. Well, yeah, you're touching again on a really interesting subject, how what we think of as the West, the western part of North America, the western part of our continent, is but a kind of latter-day comer to a long tradition of thinking of the West, meaning the New World as a whole, as the place of new beginnings, fresh start, where the historical slate can be wiped clean. The deeply mistaken mythology of an empty continent. It wasn't empty. We think it's guesswork, it's informed guesswork, but we think there might have been something in the order of 10 million native peoples in what we now call North America before contact. But yeah, so Bishop Berkeley, westward the course of empire makes its way, all this kind of stuff the idea is the West is a place where the burdens and the weight of history can be thrown off. Society can be made anew. Individual lives can be made anew. You go west, young man, and grow up with the country, said Horace Greeley. This is deep, and to repeat this idea that westward, as Thoreau said, I think westward I go free, in Europe the opposite. This is before the American West was really developed or became a cultural area in its own right. There was already this antecedently vital idea that West lay freedom, opportunity, fresh start, rejuvenation. And that persists right down to the present day.
Well, again, it's the Wild West. I think about Thoreau saying, eat a woodchuck raw, that kind of thing. You can go out to the West and you can be a savage and you can be lawless and you can recreate yourself as you suggested. It was all that mythos. I'm also struck by thinking about what really shaped the West. There's so many things. But central economically was the Transcontinental Railroad. What was that, 1860?
1869 is when it's completed, at Promontory Point, Utah. Yeah. Well, again, you can get into an argument about what the Transcontinental Railroad really did economically in the first several years of its existence. My former colleague at Stanford, Richard White, wrote a really trenchant book about this called Railroaded.
He's your co-founder, in fact.
He was the co-founder of the Lane Center. That's correct.
Yeah.
Now retired. But you can have an argument about the thesis of his book. But I think you can't have much of an argument regarding the Transcontinental Railroad, a federal project, federally stimulated project, as the template or model for a century and a half following, almost 2 centuries, of federal investment in the development of the West. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but the Transcontinental Railroad is the forerunner of the interstate highway system, which again is national in character, but had particular consequences in this region. And the enormous investment in taming the rivers to provide hydropower and irrigation and so on made the region habitable. And these are federal projects. There's just no two ways about it.
Yeah, one has to speculate how much of this can be sustained in our present political environment, as you alluded to before.
Well, that's right.
This kind of spirit of it, whatever you want to call it, yeah.
There's gathering evidence, again, we touched on this before discussing the Colorado River, what I'll call the regional plumbing system, which is absolutely vital to the character of this region, where precipitation, rainfall, or snowfall happens mostly in places that are not habitable or useful, high mountain regions and so on. And that water has to be moved to where it can be used, and it has to be stored because of the seasonal character of precipitation in the region. This is the great insight that John Wesley Powell had in that landmark publication, 1879, a report on the arid region of the United States. Was the title of the report for the United States Geological Survey. That system, which has been so effective in populating and making prosperous this region, is under severe stress from at least 2 principal drivers. One is population growth, that the system wasn't designed for population level at this level, population size of this level. And again, as we've mentioned before, climate change, which is just reducing the available water supply throughout the region. And the coincidence or convergence of population density and climate change is going to force, I believe, drastic changes in not just the technology and infrastructure of water, but the legal system that allocates it and adjudicates different claims against it and so on. And hydrological systems, watersheds, don't necessarily conform to the jurisdictional boundaries of the states. And the federal government is going to have to be, again, the principal agent of modernizing the regional plumbing system. And again, I'm pessimistic about the prospect of anything meaningful happening in our present political environment.
Well, are you hopeful about the study of the West leading to possible solutions?
Well, temperamentally, I'm hopeful by birth. That's just part of my DNA. You have to be an optimist of the will, even if you're a pessimist of the intelligence, as the old Jesuit wisdom goes. So I'm temperamentally optimistic, and I hope, again, no false modesty about it, that the kind of attention that the Lane Center, the Bill Lane Center for the American West at Stanford is trying to bring to these issues, and the kind of scientific research we're trying to bring to these issues, and training the next generation of leaders in the region, that these are all facing the right direction toward modernizing the region's technology, infrastructure, plumbing systems, and attitudes, so we can sustain the success story of this region. Again, we touched earlier on the fact that there are 2 Western movements that The historic one, which takes the center of population out to roughly mid-continent by 1880, stalls for 50, 60, 70 years, and then resumes in approximately 1940. And the big difference is these big infrastructure projects, especially on the big rivers of the West, all come online beginning in the 1930s, 1940s. And you get this renewal of the westward movement. And it actually, what had been a more or less linear movement, straight east, straight west, now begins to dip south. So the Southwest becomes, you might say, the target region for population growth since World War II. And an enormous second western movement takes place after World War II. And it's, to repeat, I think it's a success story no matter how you define it. Demographically, it's where people want to live. It's where most immigrants come to today, not the Northeast, not the old Rust Belt. They come to the Southwest and the West in general. The West supplies well over 50% of all U.S. exports to Asia, which is the most dynamic part of the global economy outside North America. So it is a success story since World War II by all the usual metrics about where do people live, where are things made, where is prosperity happening. And we can't just assume that's a self-perpetuating machine that's going to go on forever of its own energy. That I think we have to get serious about managing the region and shaping its growth and shedding some of our prejudices against the federal role here and overcoming the jurisdictional boundaries that separate so many different aspects of life. My colleague Bruce Kane, the current director of the Lane Center, maybe you're going to talk to him later, he is deep into this issue about what he calls jurisdictional fracture, complicates life in this region. And again, it's a product of this direct democracy, populist style of politics that has deep roots here going back at least a century.
What do you see as the impact of, well, undocumented migrants and sanctuary cities and the like? They've changed the whole character of the West, really.
Well, yeah, you make me think. My great-great-grandmother came from Ireland to Halifax, Nova Scotia in the 1840s. And she and my great-grandfather, who was 16 years old at the time, the two of them walked, as far as we know, from Halifax to Brooklyn and got the family started in this country.
Wow. And you're not one of those Kennedys like with a worm in the brain or anything, are you, from that family?
Not that I know of, but there are some people who think maybe that's my problem.
No, I'm thinking about JFK and his lineage.
But the point I'm trying to make here with this little piece of family history is that she never confronted, to the best of our knowledge, she never confronted an immigration officer. She just walked across the border and got herself a place to live in Brooklyn and went to work and put the kid to work, and there they went. So the concept of illegal, the way we know it, is an artifact of particularly a piece of legislation in the 1920s, which for the first time, the so-called National Origins Act, which established quotas, numerical quotas on immigration on an annual basis from any given country. Before that, illegal was really not a concept that had any meaning whatsoever. You couldn't enter the country if you had a contagious disease, okay, or if you're a known criminal. But this legal, illegal is definitional, and it depends on the political atmosphere at any given moment. So my point is simply that we are crying and desperate for a federal immigration policy that is sensitive to the economic and demographic realities of our moment in history in this place and time. And repeated efforts in Congress to get there just flopped, as we know, for the last many years. And it's now come to a boil that may determine, in fact, the outcome of the current electoral cycle. And it has to be done. We have to somehow or other provide for legal immigration. My own personal view, frankly, it is just personal. I don't pretend to have deep scholarly support for this, is that we need to recognize that in the history of immigration, not everybody who came here wanted to become a citizen. And in fact, we think, this is a number that surprises virtually everybody that I share it with, of that great tide of European migration that came between roughly the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and the outbreak of World War I in 1914, 100 years worth of migration. It's the one we all know about in the history books. We think, our best estimate is that of that great several generations worth of people. 44% of them eventually went back to their country of origin to stay, which had been their intention all along. They didn't just walk down the gangplank and jettison all of their cultural patrimony and learn English in 2 weeks and on with it. They always intended to go home, and nearly half of them did. If you understand that historical fact, it seems to me that should color our approach to immigration policy today. And path to citizenship, yes, should be available for those who want it. But we should also understand that probably a lot of people who come here today have no interest in eventually becoming American citizens, but they should have some kind of legal status. They shouldn't live in the shadows. And they should have the rights to protect their humanity and their labor standards and so on and so forth. Somehow or other, the immigration debate, at least the parts of it that I pay attention to, that notion doesn't seem to get into very, very deeply into anybody's consciousness. But I think it would, if we could understand that we need something like what the Germans call a Gastarbeiter program, a guest worker program, where we give people legal status without the expectation that they're going to be here forever. And they don't have that expectation, so why should we?
Well, another thing that strikes me about how to define the West historically is the last part of the North American continent that was settled by Europeans.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting point that the West was settled at a particular point in time, largely, well, two points in time, the 19th century, and again, that post-World War II second surge of westward movement. The other society that has a kind of a similar profile is Australia. So Australia is largely settled in roughly the same time frame as the Western U.S., mid-19th century to mid-20th century, let's say, is the big arc of time in which settlement happens. So, origins have consequences. You get settled and establish your institutions in a given historical context. You got to live with them for a few generations into the future until something drastic happens. So yeah, we're the last place settled. Again, settled mostly, not entirely, but mostly after the Civil War, in a moment when the federal government had acquired, if I can anthropomorphize this, a sense of state capacity. The federal government was, if you can think of it as an anthropomorphic entity, it acquired a sense of its capacity to do things that it didn't have before. It won the Civil War. It was going to reconstruct the South. All that ran into fierce resistance and gave up. And it was going to reshape the West. It was going to settle the West. So you get, again, in the immediate post-Civil War period, you get these well-organized scientific expeditions, the Hayden expedition, the King expedition, the Powell expedition. They're all sent out by the federal government into this region to gather scientific evidence about the character of the place as a prelude to focus what we call in our day, words they didn't know, nation building in this region. And that's what we got. And it's definitional of the unique character of this region that we were purposely a target of federal policy to make the place habitable.
Yeah, I keep thinking about all the popular culture envisioning of the West. In fact, that title, How the West Was Won. The West presumably has been won. The victory is there. It's extant.
Yeah. That phrase persists. That actually is the title of a movie, I think, but directed by Andrew McLaughlin, if I'm not mistaken. Right. Yeah, and again, the history of conquest over the indigenous peoples, not to mention over Mexico, the Mexican cession brings a huge piece of real estate into the West in the 1840s. That's another bit of winning, you might say, or conquest, and the native peoples as well. Where do
Canada and Mexico fit into the West and the vision of the West? Because they are Westerns.
Of course they are. And our definition of the West at the Lane Center is the United States west, or on the sunset side of the 100th meridian, Canada west of Ontario, and all of Mexico. Because with the exception of the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula, all of Mexico is west of the 100th meridian. And it has, again, a lot of characteristics that it shares with the United States west. Big parts of it are quite arid. Heavy presence of indigenous peoples in the general population. So, to be honest, we haven't quite yet fully fulfilled our ambition to incorporate Mexico to the degree we'd like into our activities, but we're working on it. And to repeat, this symposium we'll organize this spring the Canadians will be our full partners in that, talking about how issues that transcend the artificial political boundary of the 49th parallel, how they play out differently in the two sovereign nations, and how they also require cooperation across that boundary if they're to be managed successfully.
Last question is, what do you envision for the Lane Center? What do you hope for?
Well, I hope that we continue to be a robust place in both the teaching and research dimensions. We're currently under negotiation at Stanford with a complicated matter of where our physical space is going to be going forward. And Bruce Kane, the current director, who's been terrifically good, I think, wonderful director of the center, he's coming to the end of his time in office, so we're about to search for a new director. So I'm hopeful that we'll continue to rack up the kinds of consequential successes that we've had over the last 20 or 25 years. And that we'll finally, and you might say without further argument, establish the fact that Stanford is a good neighbor and is interested in the study of its neighborhood, with which it has a very, very deeply involved history.
Well, congratulations for all the successes and certainly for the extraordinary career you've had. It's been really a great privilege to know you and to read you and to study you. And I want to also initially thank all who joined us for this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and remind you that you can listen to us on Apple and Spotify and on our website at graymatter.show. If you haven't yet become a member of the podcast, I invite you to join by simply going to the website, graymatter.show, where you can find previous episodes of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you might have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. And let me also say that this episode, again, has been supported by the Bill Lane Center for the American West, Stanford University's premier place for study of the past, present, and future of Western North America. You can learn more about the Bill Lane Center at west.stanford.edu or follow them on Instagram, Threads, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And let me thank the Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Colin, Jeff, Colleen, and Tanya, and a special thanks to our guest, David Kennedy.
Thank you, Michael. It's been a pleasure and a lot of fun, as usual, talking with you.
Always enjoy talking to you. I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.